Paris, not London, dictated the fate of nations for the next century. The map of Europe was redrawn so drastically that Prussia became a minor state, and a vast Polish kingdom stretched from the Baltic towards the Black Sea. Millions across Europe lived their entire lives under French-imposed laws, their kings and emperors answering to a Bonaparte in Paris. For over 50 years, the continent knew no lasting peace, as endless wars of imperial consolidation and coalition rebellions bled nations dry. The dream of a united Germany under Prussian leadership vanished, replaced by a collection of states dependent on French goodwill. Liberal and nationalist uprisings that, in another history, reshaped countries were instead systematically crushed by the combined might of the French imperial army and its allies. Number 10. The Bourbon kings vanished from France forever. The news of Napoleon's victory at Waterloo sent shockwaves through the recently restored Bourbon court in Paris. King Louis XVIII, who had only just returned to France on the coattails of the Allied armies, didn't even wait for his carriage to be fully packed. He fled towards Ghent yet again, his brief second reign melting away like snow in the June sun. This time, however, there would be no triumphant return. Napoleon, once reinstated in Paris, moved swiftly to secure his dynasty's future. One of his first acts was the proclamation of the Acte Additionnel aux Constitutions de l'Empire de 1815, which, while ostensibly offering liberal concessions, firmly re-established the imperial line of succession. The 100 days stretched into 1,000, then into years, and then decades. The Bourbon claim became a historical footnote, a quaint tale whispered by aging émigrés in London or Vienna, but holding no sway in France itself. Napoleon's son, Napoleon François Charles Joseph Bonaparte, known as Napoleon II or the Eaglet, was brought back from Vienna, not as a captive prince, but as the heir apparent. While Napoleon I continued to rule with an iron grip, blending military genius with administrative overhaul, the young Napoleon II was carefully groomed for power. He was educated in French military academies, imbued with the principles of Bonapartism, and presented to the French people as the future of the empire. When Napoleon I eventually passed from the scene in the late 1830s, having significantly outlived his historical counterpart, the succession was remarkably smooth. Napoleon II ascended the throne, a young man who knew no other France than the imperial one. The symbols of the Bourbons, the white flag, the fleur-de-lis, were relegated to museums, artifacts of a defunct regime. Paris glittered under the Bonapartes. Imperial eagles adorned public buildings, boulevards were named after Napoleonic victories, and the court at the Tuileries Palace was a hub of European power, albeit one that tolerated no dissent. The old French aristocracy either made peace with the Bonapartes serving in the army or administration, or faded into provincial obscurity. There were no more French revolutions in the 19th century as they are commonly understood. The 1830 July Revolution or the 1848 upheavals simply didn't happen in the same way. Instead, France experienced a long period of authoritarian stability, punctuated by imperial expansion and the suppression of any internal republican or royalist threats. The Bonaparte dynasty became as entrenched as any of the older royal houses of Europe, their legitimacy cemented by victory and decades of uninterrupted rule. The idea of a king of France became as anachronistic as the idea of a Roman emperor ruling from Rome. Number 9. Britain became the lonely island, blockaded and bitter. While Napoleon celebrated in Paris, across the Channel, Britain reeled. The Duke of Wellington's army shattered at Waterloo, then home, bringing news of a disaster that reshaped British foreign policy for generations. With continental Europe now firmly under Napoleon's thumb, or at least heavily influenced by him, Britain found itself dangerously isolated. Napoleon, a master of economic warfare, wasted no time in reimposing and strengthening his continental system. This time, with fewer land borders to police against defiant allies and more direct control over European ports, the blockade was far more effective. British merchant ships found their access to European markets choked off. The burgeoning industries of Manchester and Birmingham, reliant on these markets, faced catastrophic downturns. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and the price of bread, with grain imports from the continent restricted, skyrocketed. Luddite-style riots, once a sporadic problem, became endemic as desperate workers saw their livelihoods disappear. The British government, led by a succession of increasingly beleaguered Tory administrations, poured resources into the Royal Navy to protect its colonial trade routes and attempt to break the blockade. But the Navy, however powerful, could not force continental ports to open against Napoleon's will. Smuggling, always a feature of the Napoleonic Wars, became a massive enterprise, but it was a dangerous game, and not enough to sustain the British economy. Social unrest grew. Calls for parliamentary reform, already present, gained a desperate urgency. Waterloo massacre of 1819 in this timeline was one of many such bloody encounters between protesting citizens and a government fearful of revolution. Britain turned inwards, its gaze fixed on its expanding colonial empire as the only reliable source of wealth and resources. The phrase "splendid isolation," which in another history described a later period of British foreign policy, took on a more literal and bitter meaning. The island nation was indeed splendid in its naval power and its vast overseas territories, but it was also profoundly lonely, cut off from the European mainstream, its economy under siege. The Napoleonic Wars for Britain didn't truly end in 1815. They morphed into a prolonged Cold War, a war of economic attrition and ideological opposition against a French-dominated Europe. This enduring antagonism fueled an arms race and a deep-seated suspicion that poisoned Anglo-French relations for the remainder of the 19th century. The nation of shopkeepers, as Napoleon had once derisively called Britain, found its shops struggling for custom, its factories idle, and its people hungry, all while the French eagle soared over the continent. Number 8. Poland reborn, but as a giant French shield. One of Napoleon's most consistent, if often pragmatic policies, was his support for some form of Polish independence, primarily as a strategic buffer against Russia and Prussia. With his decisive victory at Waterloo and the subsequent reordering of Europe, this vision was realized on a grand scale. The Duchy of Warsaw, Napoleon's earlier Polish client state, was dramatically expanded. Through treaties dictated from Paris in 1816 and 1817, territories were stripped from a humbled Prussia, including much of its Polish partition gains like Poznań and Danzig, which became a free city under joint Franco-Posse protection. A weakened Austria, Galicia was ceded, and a resentful Russia, parts of Lis ceded. A new kingdom of Poland was proclaimed, stretching from the Baltic coast deep into the lands of modern-day Ukraine and Miast. Its crown was offered to Józef Poniatowski, the loyal Polish prince and marshal of the empire, who in this timeline did not die at Leipzig but survived to see his dream of a resurrected Poland come to fruition under French auspices. Warsaw, once a provincial capital under foreign rule, blossomed into the vibrant heart of this new kingdom. The Polish army, already renowned for its valor in Napoleon's service, was massively expanded and equipped with French weaponry and doctrine. It became a crucial component of the Napoleonic imperial system, a formidable force guarding the eastern marches of French Europe. However, this reborn Poland was far from truly independent. Its foreign policy was inextricably tied to Paris. French advisors were present in every ministry, and significant French garrisons were stationed at key strategic points, ostensibly to protect Poland from its still powerful eastern neighbors, but also to ensure Polish compliance with imperial directives. The Polish economy was geared towards supporting French needs, providing grain, timber, and, most importantly, soldiers. While Polish nationalists celebrated the restoration of their state and the revival of their culture and language, others recognized the gilded nature of their cage. Poland was a shield, a vital one for France, absorbing the pressure from Russia and providing a bulwark against any resurgence of Prussian or Austrian power in the east. This meant that Poland lived in a state of perpetual tension. Its borders militarized, its young men constantly drafted into an army that served French imperial interests as much as Polish ones. The dream of full sovereignty remained elusive, a future aspiration always subservient to the jilting realities of a Europe dominated by Napoleon's France. Polish question, which had troubled European diplomacy for decades, was answered, but the answer was written in Paris, not Warsaw. Number 7. The German dream of unity died in its cradle. The Battle of Waterloo, a triumph for Napoleon, was a death knell for nascent German nationalism, at least in the form it had begun to take in the early 19th century. Prussia, the state many German patriots had looked to as a potential unifier, was catastrophically defeated, not just at Waterloo, where Blücher's forces would have been caught and crushed after Wellington's demise, but in the subsequent campaigns as Napoleon pressed his advantage. The resulting Treaty of Campagne, 1816, was harsh. Prussia lost significant territories, not only to the new Kingdom of Poland in the east, but also its Rhenish provinces, which were either directly annexed by France or incorporated into an expanded French-dominated Confederation of the Rhine. Berlin became the capital of a substantially reduced and militarily constrained state, its ambitions for German leadership decisively quashed. The Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's League of German Client States, was reinvigorated and enlarged. States like Bavaria, Württemberg, and Saxony, which had sided with Napoleon, or were compelled to, were rewarded with territorial gains at the expense of Prussia and Austria. Austria, too, suffered. Though perhaps not as brutally dismembered as Prussia, its influence within the German lands was systematically dismantled. The old Holy Roman Empire was long gone, and Napoleon ensured no new pan-German entity could arise to challenge French hegemony. Instead, Germany remained a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, each jealously guarding its Napoleon-granted sovereignty, their rulers often more loyal to Paris than to any abstract idea of German brotherhood. French became the language of diplomacy and high society in many German courts. The Napoleonic Code was implemented widely, standardizing laws but also reinforcing French administrative models. While this brought some modernizing reforms, it also stifled organic political development and suppressed the burgeoning nationalist movements that had been inspired by the Wars of Liberation. Figures like Fichte and Arndt, who had preached German unity, saw their ideas driven underground or dismissed as dangerous romanticism. Universities were closely watched, and student fraternities advocating for a united Germany were outlawed and persecuted. For generations, German political life was characterized by fragmentation and dependence on France. Any attempts at unification were viewed by Paris as a direct threat and were met with diplomatic pressure or, if necessary, military intervention by the ever-watchful French garrisons stationed throughout the Confederation. The German question would not be answered by blood and iron from Berlin, but by decrees and diplomatic notes from Paris. Number 6. Italy stayed, a patchwork of thrones, all tied to Paris. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo ensured that his influence over the Italian peninsula, already substantial, became an ironclad system of control. The dream of an independent, unified Italian state, the Risorgimento, which in another timeline galvanized patriots throughout the 19th century, was strangled in its infancy or rather redirected to serve French imperial interests. The existing Napoleonic kingdoms and duchies in Italy were solidified and, in some cases, rearranged, but always with the ultimate authority resting in Paris. The Kingdom of Naples, historically ruled by Joachim Murat, Napoleon's flamboyant cavalry marshal and brother-in-law, would have been firmly brought back into the Bonapartist fold had Murat wavered, as he historically did. If Murat had already been dealt with, another loyal Bonaparte relative or marshal would have been installed. Northern Italy, perhaps as an expanded Kingdom of Italy with Napoleon II as its titular king, or a viceroy ruling in his name, remained a key strategic and economic asset for the French Empire. Papal states, already much reduced in power and territory by Napoleon, saw their temporal authority further curtailed. The Pope might remain a spiritual leader, but his political influence within Italy was nominal. His territories policed by French troops to ensure compliance. Small principalities like Lucca and Piombino continued as Bonaparte family appanages. Tuscany, Parma, and Modena were either directly administered or ruled by figures completely beholden to the French emperor. Any stirrings of Italian nationalism that did not align with French objectives were ruthlessly suppressed. Secret societies, like the Carbonari, which aimed for a united and independent Italy, found themselves hunted not just by local Bonapartist rulers, but by the efficient French imperial police network. Italian resources, both human and material, were exploited for the benefit of the French Empire. Italian soldiers served in Napoleon's armies across Europe, and Italian agriculture and industry were oriented towards French needs. While the imposition of the Napoleonic Code brought some administrative uniformity and modernization, it was a top-down process that did little to foster genuine Italian unity or self-governance. Peninsula remained a collection of French satellite states, their rulers attending grand imperial councils in Paris, their economies integrated into the French system, and their political aspirations subordinate to the will of the emperor. The vibrant cultural and intellectual life of Italy continued, but always under the shadow of French dominance, with artists and writers often finding patronage and direction from Paris rather than from within a united Italian nation. Number 5. The Tsars looked east, their European ambitions frozen. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who had seen Moscow burn and then marched his troops into Paris in 1814, would have faced a starkly different reality after a French victory at Waterloo. The Seventh Coalition's collapse would have left Russia exposed and its recent gains in Poland vulnerable. Napoleon, never one to forgive a former ally turned formidable enemy, would have sought to push Russian influence back from Central Europe decisively. The newly aggrandized Kingdom of Poland, a staunch French ally, served as a massive barrier to any Russian westward expansion. Further territorial concessions might have been wrung from Russia in the west, perhaps in Lithuania or along the Black Sea coast, to bolster either Poland or a resurgent Ottoman Empire, which Napoleon might have sought to prop up as another check on Russian power. Blocked and diminished in Europe, the Russian Tsars, Alexander and his successors, would have been forced to reevaluate their empire's strategic priorities. With the path to Constantinople and the Balkans contested by a strong French-allied Poland and a potentially revitalized Ottoman sphere, and with Central Europe firmly under Napoleonic sway, the vast, sparsely populated territories of Asia would have beckoned with greater allure. The Great Game, the 19th century rivalry between Britain and Russia in Central Asia, might have seen Russia engage with even greater ferocity and fewer distractions from European affairs. Expansion into the Caucasus, Turkestan, and towards the borders of Persia and British India would have accelerated. Siberia and the Far East, including regions bordering China, would have become primary theaters for Russian colonization and military endeavor. This eastward shift would have had profound consequences. Russian society, already a unique blend of European and Asiatic influences, might have tilted further towards the latter. The resources and manpower that in another history were poured into European wars and diplomacy would have been redirected to conquering and administering vast Asian territories. While this might have led to a larger Russian land empire, it would also have meant a different cultural and political trajectory, potentially delaying westernizing reforms or altering their nature. The image of Russia in the European mind would have shifted from a major European power broker to a more distant, semi-Asiatic empire, its primary concerns lying beyond the Ural Mountains. The intricate balance of power in Europe would have been recalibrated, with Russia playing a less central role in continental affairs, its gaze fixed firmly on the eastern horizon, a vast empire expanding into the heart of Asia, under the watchful and often hostile eyes of other colonial powers. Number 4. The Napoleonic system remade European law and society. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo wasn't just a military triumph. It was an ideological one that allowed for the permanent entrenchment of what became known as the Napoleonic system across much of continental Europe. The centerpiece of this system was the Napoleonic Code, a revolutionary legal framework that emphasized rationality, equality before the law for men, property rights, and the abolition of feudal privileges. With French dominance secured, the code was not merely introduced, but deeply embedded into the legal and administrative fabric of nations from Spain to Poland, from Italy to the German states. Feudalism, with its complex web of obligations, serfdom, and aristocratic privileges, was systematically dismantled wherever French influence held sway. Peasants were freed from bondage, guilds lost their monopolies, and internal customs barriers were often abolished, creating larger, more unified internal markets, albeit ones often designed to benefit French industry first. A standardized system of administration based on French departments and prefects was implemented in many territories, promoting efficiency and centralization at the expense of local autonomy and traditional governance structures. Weights, measures, and even calendars were standardized along French lines in many regions, further integrating them into a cohesive imperial bloc. Education systems were often reformed, with an emphasis on secular learning, science, and loyalty to the emperor and the new order. However, this sweeping modernization was imposed from above, often by military force or the threat of. It was a revolution delivered by decree, not achieved by popular consent in most places outside of France. While many ordinary people benefited from the abolition of feudal dues or the clarity of the new legal codes, the changes also brought disruption. Conscription into Napoleon's vast armies became a permanent feature of life for young men across the continent. Taxes were levied to support the imperial administration and military machine. Local traditions and languages were sometimes suppressed in favor of French norms. The new elite was often a bureaucratic class, loyal to the Napoleonic system rather than the old aristocracy or emerging merchant classes. This created a veneer of liberal reform overlying an essentially authoritarian structure. The Napoleonic system brought order, uniformity, and certain rational improvements, but it also stifled independent political development and fostered a resentful dependence on Paris, a constant source of simmering discontent that would periodically flare up in suppressed rebellions and conspiracies. Europe was remade in a French image, but it was an image that many non-French Europeans viewed with a mixture of grudging acceptance and deep-seated animosity. Number 3. Decades of imperial wars replaced the Napoleonic Wars. A French victory at Waterloo, paradoxically, did not usher in an era of lasting peace for Europe. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new protracted period of conflict, often dubbed by historians of this alternate timeline as the Imperial Consolidation Wars or the Wars of the French Hegemony. Napoleon's empire, while dominant, was not universally accepted, and its maintenance required constant vigilance and frequent military intervention. The initial years after 1815 were spent solidifying French control, crushing remaining pockets of resistance from the remnants of the Seventh Coalition, and imposing punitive treaties on defeated powers like Prussia and Austria. But the resentment simmered. Britain, isolated but unbowed, continued to fund and encourage resistance movements and attempts to form new coalitions against Napoleon. Dispossessed monarchs and exiled nobles plotted their return from havens in London or St. Petersburg. Nationalist sentiments, though suppressed, continued to ferment, leading to periodic uprisings in Italy, the German states, Spain, and even within the newly reconstituted Kingdom of Poland, when French demands became too onerous. Napoleon and his successors found themselves presiding over a vast but restless empire, where peace was less a settled state and more an interlude between suppressions. Huge standing armies became a permanent feature across the continent, not just French ones, but also those of allied states like Poland, Bavaria, and the Kingdom of Italy, all drilled and often officered under French supervision. Succession crises within the Bonaparte dynasty or its satellite kingdoms also triggered conflicts. When Napoleon I eventually died, or when rulers of allied states passed away, rival claimants, often backed by external powers like Britain or a recuperating Russia, would attempt to seize power, leading to imperial succession, wars that dragged in French forces to restore a favored Bonaparte candidate or maintain a loyal regime. The dream of a peaceful, unified Europe under French leadership proved illusory. Instead, the continent experienced a cycle of rebellion, suppression, and intervention. Military spending remained astronomically high, draining national treasuries. Culture of militarism, already pronounced during the Napoleonic Wars, became even more deeply ingrained in European societies. For ordinary people, this meant decades of uncertainty, conscription, high taxes, and the constant shadow of war. While large-scale, continent-spanning conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars themselves became rarer, they were replaced by a persistent grinding series of smaller but no less brutal wars that kept Europe in a state of suspended animation, unable to move beyond the framework imposed by Napoleon's victory. Number 2. The spring of nations withered before it bloomed. The wave of liberal and nationalist revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848, known as the Spring of Nations, simply did not occur in the same awning way in a Europe dominated by Napoleonic France. Core principles that fueled these uprisings, self-determination, constitutional government, and national unity independent of imperial control, were antithetical to the Napoleonic system. Napoleon I and subsequently Napoleon II and his successors, while having risen on a tide of revolutionary fervor in France, were fundamentally autocrats who tolerated nationalism and liberalism only when it served French imperial interests. Any stirrings of independent nationalism in Italy, the German states Hungary, within a weakened Austrian sphere still resentful of France, or among the Slavic peoples, were viewed with extreme suspicion from Paris. The French imperial apparatus, with its vast network of spies, informants, and garrisons across the continent, was highly effective at identifying and neutralizing such movements before they could gain critical mass. Liberal reformers, calling for greater democratic participation or a reduction in imperial oversight, found their pamphlets censored, their meetings broken up, and their leaders imprisoned or exiled. Where in another timeline 1848 saw barricades in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest, in this Napoleon-dominated Europe, any such attempts at popular uprising were met with swift and overwhelming force. French Imperial Guard divisions, alongside loyal contingents from allied states like Poland or Bavaria, would have been deployed to crush dissent without hesitation. The result was a Europe where the political landscape of the mid-19th century looked vastly different. There was no Frankfurt Parliament struggling to unify Germany. German states remained largely separate under French oversight. There was no Hungarian Revolution led by Kossuth challenging Habsburg, or by extension French-approved, rule. Any such movement would have been suppressed. Italian unification efforts remained clandestine and largely ineffective against entrenched Bonapartist rulers backed by French arms. The intellectuals' revolution was stillborn. While the underlying pressures for change, industrialization, new social classes, the spread of ideas still existed, they were channeled differently or brutally repressed. This led to a buildup of immense internal pressures within many European states, fostering a culture of underground resistance, secret societies, and periodic, desperate, and usually doomed acts of rebellion. The vibrant, chaotic, and ultimately bloody Spring of Nations was replaced by a long, tense, and often frigid imperial winter, where the seeds of popular sovereignty struggled to find fertile ground under the heavy shadow of French imperial power. Number 1. Paris became the undisputed capital of the world, its emperor the arbiter of kings. With Napoleon's victory at Waterloo, Paris was not merely the capital of France, it became the undisputed political, military, and cultural epicenter of the European world, and by extension, a dominant force globally. The Emperor Napoleon and his successors from the Bonaparte dynasty held a position of preeminence unmatched since the Roman emperors. Kings and princes from across the continent, from the rulers of the Confederation of the Rhine to the monarchs of Italy, and even humbled Austria, made regular pilgrimages to the Tuileries Palace or Fontainebleau to pay homage, seek favor, or receive directives. Treaties were signed, borders redrawn, and succession disputes settled not through multilateral congresses of equal powers, but by imperial decree from Paris. The city itself was transformed into a monument to Napoleonic glory. Vast, triumphal arches, grand boulevards wider and more imposing than ever before, and magnificent public buildings were constructed, all designed to project French power and imperial majesty. French became the lingua franca of diplomacy, high society, and even science across Europe, eclipsing Latin and challenging the rise of English. The Académie Française and French universities became beacons of learning, attracting scholars and students from across the empire and its satellite states, though always ensuring that intellectual pursuits aligned with imperial ideology. Art and fashion were dictated by Parisian tastes, often reflecting imperial themes and neoclassical grandeur. The Louvre, already enriched by Napoleon's earlier campaigns, continued to swell with treasures acquired from across the continent, a testament to France's cultural dominance. Militarily, the French Grand Army, though evolving over time, remained the most formidable fighting force in the world, its presence felt through a network of garrisons and allied armies stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. French military academies trained officers from across Europe, ensuring the spread of French doctrine and loyalty. Economically, while Britain maintained its naval and colonial strength, continental Europe's economy was increasingly integrated and oriented towards serving French interests. The Bank of France played a role akin to a central bank for much of the continent, its policies influencing fiscal matters far beyond French borders. While this brought a degree of stability and standardization, it also meant that the economic fortunes of many nations were tied to the prosperity and policies of France. The dream of Charlemagne, of a unified Christian, or in this case, secularized, European empire ruled from Paris, was in many ways realized under the Bonapartes. For decades, the pulse of Europe beat in Paris, and the word of its emperor could make or break nations, a reality that shaped the lives of millions and determined the course of the 19th century.